Hey everyone, Robert Algio here, and in this video I want to walk you through the techniques I use to create two different responsive menu approaches in the demo files this week. We're not going to go over every tiny detail of these menu files because I think all of you are sophisticated enough in your knowledge of CSS to see my files, see how they're working, and then repurpose them for your own uses if need be. But we'll take a look at the code. I'll talk a little bit about why I did certain things the way I did, and then you'll have the code yourself to look at and review after this video. So let me show you the two menus I have. Again, as is almost always the case, because this is a technical demonstration, I didn't take too much time actually designing the page here. I just wanted to make something serviceable and functional. So I have a web page here that has basically two media query states. There's a mobile state here that's sort of a 320 to 480, and then anything above 480. And in this case, this menu is a drop-down style responsive menu where the same links that we see here are being made visible through a drop-down mechanism, and then a second one here where those same links are being made visible with sort of a hamburger slide in, slide out menu method. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about how these techniques work. One thing I want to be really clear about though is both approaches have their pros and cons, and there are a number of other mobile menu design paradigms as well. I think these two are the most common and are sort of the most useful for demonstration purposes and for beginning your journey in terms of coding and designing mobile menus. But for your assignment this week, please don't feel like you have to imitate these approaches. If you feel you have a good idea for a way to deploy a mobile menu within a site, please feel free to do that. So let's talk a little bit about the code in these two in these two menus. So let's look at the drop-down one first. So I'm going to open up my mobile inspector here, lock us into that 320 view, and I'm going to open up a little bit of my code here. So if you remember from the previous video demonstration, we talked about how we can use a checkbox and a label to toggle a menu state, and that's basically exactly what we're doing here. You can see I have a UL element with a few links, but that UL element has a max height of 0 and overflow of hidden, so we can't actually see those elements. But then it also has a max height transition of ½ second, and so when we click on the label, that transition triggers, and then our max height becomes basically 1000 at that point. And we're using that same sibling selector methodology, where we're using the label to check the box, and then that checkbox is used to apply sibling styles to the list, which in this case is a new max height for that element. So similar to the previous demonstration, the only real difference here is we've taken a lot more care in styling the links. And then once we get above 480 pixels, we use some CSS overrides to hide both the label and the checkbox, and then make our links appear as sort of like a slightly more common inline display. But again, this link here is the label element. That's toggling the checkbox, which is then triggering a change in style, which is then managed by the transition. I'll show you sort of how that works in the code in just a moment. I'd like to show you here before the code this sort of slide-in approach. This is another pretty common mobile menu deployment. So what I have here is, instead of text in my label, you can see I have a label with 3 black bars inside of it basically. And if we click on that, it triggers a transition that brings this element out from the side. And then there's a second label to retoggle that same state. The really cool thing about labels is you can have more than one label affecting a specific element. So in this case, I have a label in my header that looks like that hamburger menu, and then I have a label in my menu itself that has an X inside of it. Both of those labels, you can see, are targeting the same input. So they're both being used to toggle that checkbox, and then that checkbox is causing a transition. In this case, the transition is not a height transition, but a left transition. So you can see here the way I've designed the menu. I've given the menu a width of 66%, but then I give it a left value of -66. That has the effect of pushing the menu off the left-hand side of the page. But then, when we toggle the menu, I give it a left value of 0, and so it's transitioning from that -66% left into that 0% left, which has the effect of pulling that element into the browser window. And then we're just using that label to toggle. We're using some CSS to style the way the menu and those links look. But then once we get out to a larger state, right about here, you can see we're returning to that same kind of inline default menu appearance. So I'd like to sort of walk you through the code. Again, I'm not going to reproduce the code in real time because I think that would be really, really tedious for a video demonstration. But I will make this code available to you, but I want to spend some time walking through what's going to be in the code that I give you. So you'll see in the code there are 4 HTML files. This one here, index checkbox toggle and index transition, those are the 2 HTML files that I used in the previous video demonstrations. Then you can see here index drop down and index slide left. Those are the HTML files with those functioning menus, the drop down and the slider menu. Then I want to walk you through my CSS. So I have Sass files using that same Sass pre-compiler that we've been using for the last couple of weeks. And in my main file, you can see I've added some comments here so that you can see what these files are doing. But I'd like to walk you through these files. So why don't we open up my CSS file here, and then in this window, we'll take a look at those individual Sass files. So the first one is vars. In this file, I just define a bunch of variables, a handful of colors, a couple font styles, and then some basic typography styles. Then I have my reset file, some really simple resets, just a couple things to clear out some margin and some padding. Where things start to get really interesting are once we get to these menu files. So in the menu drop-down file, these are all the visual styles associated with the drop-down menu. So here's where I hide the menu, but here's also where I declare my link colors, give it the padding and the margin that creates this sort of block element look to the menu. So that's all happening in this drop-down CSS file, Sass file. Then the same thing here for that menu slide left. This is where I define the visual characteristics of that slider menu. This one's a little bit more complicated because we're using some absolute positioning and some negative left values to move that menu out of the window. But I think you spend some time looking at this and looking in the web inspector, and this will kind of make some sense. We're basically just creating those labels and that menu and then moving it off the window. Menu controller is where we manage those transitions. So you can see here on this line I hide the checkbox visually so that the user only sees the labels. And then in here these styles control the drop-down menu. So I'm saying here let's transition the max height. Let's give it a max height of 1000, and then let's put some margin on the label so that the checkbox, so that the label doesn't butt up right against the list. And that's what you can see happening here. I'm changing that max height and transitioning that max height based on whether or not I've clicked that label. And then basically the same thing here on that slide left, but we only need to change one thing here. We're just transitioning that left value. We're saying we want to go from a left value of -66 to a left value of 0. And you can see that's what's happening here. If we go to a mobile view, we start with a left value of -66%, but as soon as I click a label, it transitions to a left value of 0. And then once I click the other label, it transitions back out to that left value. And that's all being driven by this sibling selector combined with this checked selector. We're checking whether or not the checkbox has been checked, and then based on that we're applying a new rule to its sibling list, and we're transitioning that list. It's the same methodology in both lists, whether it's a drop-down or a slider menu. The only difference is which value are we changing, either the height or the left value. And then just two really simple style sheets here. a mobile media query, and then a media query at 480 to kind of set some widths. And then this is sort of an important part here. This is a media query at 480 that basically resets the list style so that they appear in line. So for both of these lists, there were different things that needed to be overridden to give them that same visual inline appearance, and that's basically what's happening in this UI disable file, where we're sort of resetting those menu styles to have them be visible in line. The most important part of that is we're hiding both the checkbox and the label. In both the drop down and the slide menu, the checkbox and the label both get hidden because we don't want someone accidentally clicking a label when we don't want that menu transitioning in and out. And then just two other sheets, that transition style sheet and that checkbox toggle style sheet from the previous video demonstration. So that was a really quick overview. I would really encourage you to spend some time investigating the code, opening up these web files in your web inspector and kind of see what's happening under the hood. But again, the basic idea is we have a visual style that we're using a transition and a checkbox to toggle, and it's just a matter of figuring out what do you want your menu to look like and what values need to change to hide that menu. I'm sure you'll have questions after looking over these files, so please don't hesitate to email me or hit me up in the Blackboard discussion board with any questions that you might have pertaining to any of this information. But once you've reviewed the files and once you've reviewed the video demos, head over to the assignment folder to see what your task is for this week. Good luck!